Well, thank you very much. I will canter through the three major geopolitical theaters, the Euro-Atlantic, the Greater Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. These three geostrategic theaters are not just connected, not merely interdependent, but actually, in fact, codependent. And I will end up with three maxims, one for the West, one for what is now called the Global South, and one for companies. Europe. Everything is about the Russia-Ukraine war now. The only recent equivalent in our memory was Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. Then it was the Middle East security order that was at risk. People understood that if Saddam Hussein conquered Kuwait, the next stop might be Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, initially, the same conclusion wasn't drawn with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, even though that was a huge assault on the present European strategic order. The initial response of the key Western states reflected their strategic culture as interpreted by their head of government of the day. And let me caricature them briefly. The United States, there's a war in Europe. Oh my goodness, it's all about NATO. Who's a member, Article 5 or not? No one worried whether Kuwait had a defense treaty with other countries. They knew the strategic order of the Middle East was under threat. There needed to be support for the defense of Kuwait and expelling Iraq from it. France, there's a war in Europe. We will do the new diplomatic concert, bring the United States and Putin together and be the authors of the new European security order. Germany, there's a war in Europe. Oh my goodness, we'll sign a check for 100 billion euros. We'll increase our defense budget. Let's hope it's over quickly so we don't have to take a decision. The United Kingdom, there's a war in Europe. We know who's good. We know who's bad. We'll jump in. We'll support the good. Oh my goodness, where's the United States? These were the first 6 weeks of the war until it settled into a more thermostatically controlled response, somewhere between cold and hot, finding warm, deciding which weapons would be useful and which might be provocative. But in a way, the response was strategically illiterate. All the initial talk in the West was about escalation, but defense is not escalation. Counterattack is needed for defense. In the Cold War, the West doctrine was flexible response and escalation dominance. What did we see here? Sequential response and escalation fear. Rather than putting the fear of escalation in Putin's head, the West maintained it in its own, in its intramural discussions. Putin is hypersensitive to perceived provocation, but he is also hyper-responsive to perceived license. The more the West said publicly what it would not do, the more room for maneuver Putin had for himself. Let me give you a brief idea of what might have happened last April if we had decided on escalation dominance. Black Sea is closed. Biggest importer of Ukrainian wheat in the world is Egypt. The second biggest is Indonesia. We have a problem with the Global South. Food security is important. Putin has unilaterally closed the Black Sea. Let's take an American frigate, a US destroyer, a British destroyer, a French frigate, reflag them Bulgarian and Romanian. No need to ring up Erdogan and ask for permission to go through the straits because Bulgaria and Romania are NATO Black Sea littoral straits. And we announced to the world we're just going to escort fertilizer and wheat out from the Black Sea to feed the Global South. Would Putin have taken the risk of a war with NATO by sinking one of those ships? Not certain. Nothing is certain. But we should have taken some action to put the fear of escalation in Putin's head. And what we did was talk too much about NATO and not about UN Article 51. And for that, we lost the Global South. What we should have said from the beginning was that this was a Russian war of recolonization. It was an imperialist adventure. It was no different than if France had decided to take over Algeria because Algeria wasn't really a nation. Ukraine is not really a nation. We'll take it over. I was amazed that at the Munich Security Conference, the Vice President of Colombia said, well, you know, we want peace between Ukraine and Russia because after all, these were all part of one country. As they would say here in Miami, no me vengas con tonterías. You know, honestly, this had been an independent country for a very long time. And to the Chinese, we should have said the European security order is a core interest of the West. In any case, what is the result of all this? The result of all this is, one, that the geopolitical center of gravity in Europe has moved to the east and to the north. France and Germany can be important engines still for European Union policy. They are insufficient engines for the European security order. The swing votes, so to speak, will come from the east and the north. Yesterday, finally, Finland was admitted as a member of NATO after a 9-hour debate in the Turkish parliament. Second result is that Russia will be a hugely reduced power, incapable of exporting any public goods internationally, and I'll come back to this point in a second. The Middle East. Maybe 10 years ago, in the US strategic calculus, the Middle East was number 1 in US priorities, with Asia number 2 and Europe a distant third. Now that is reversed, with Europe in number 1 place, Asia number 2, but really co-equal number 1, ready to overtake Europe as soon as the Russia-Ukraine war is settled, and the Middle East a distant third in US strategic priorities. That might be a good thing. It certainly has encouraged what I call more strategic self-determination by the states of the Gulf that are defining their own strategies without constant reference to what the US may or may not prefer. Gulf leaders do not begin their morning meetings with the question, what will the United States think if we do this? But there remain huge security issues, mainly caused by Iran. Attention is often paid to Iran's nuclear program or to its ballistic missile program. But for the Islamic Republic of Iran, these are not nearly as important as their other strategic asset, Iran's influence networks, because it is those influence networks managed by the IRGC that day to day have the possibility of changing the balance of power in the Middle East. In Damascus, Baghdad, Beirut, Sana'a. Nuclear weapons, interesting. Ballistic missiles, interesting. But their influence networks are the number 1 strategic asset they have, which will not be easily negotiated away and which will not easily be sanctioned away. They will have to be fought if security in the greater Middle East is to be preserved. And their proliferation of advanced technologies, especially UAV technologies to the region, have posed the biggest direct threat to the GCC countries, especially Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And here there is a connection with Europe. Last November at the IISS Manama Dialogue, Ursula von der Leyen said, "We now understand the security dilemma in the Gulf. We now see Shahab 136's UAVs raining on Ukraine from Russia. These were provided by Iran." In the middle of her speech, the whole hall clapped. Now in the Gulf, in a pre-dinner speech, everyone in the audience will clap at the end of the speech because people are very courteous. Everybody will clap also because they want to go to dinner. They clapped in the middle of her speech when she spoke about now understanding the security dilemma of the Middle East, because here was a European leader showing strategic empathy and an ability to understand the different security dilemmas of other countries. Now there's a lot of de-escalation going on. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran have concluded an arrangement to eventually restore their formal diplomatic relations. For me, as a Kremlinologist, it was interesting to observe that that was signed not by the Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia, not by the Foreign Minister of Iran, but by the National Security Advisor to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and the National Security Advisor of the Supreme Leader of Iran. It strikes me that there's more of a security element to this arrangement than purely a diplomatic one. But de-escalation does not mean détente, and the future will still turn around Iran. And the two big questions is, how will we live with a nuclear Iran? Because I rather doubt that it will be stopped soon. It's only about 3 weeks away now from having the fissile material for a nuclear weapon. And conversely, how will the region live with a normal Iran of 60 million well-educated people who might want to re-globalize their country? That might well be a problem that the GCC states would welcome having. In the meantime, as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is modernizing, empowering its women, and as the Crown Prince said at the first FII conference, returning more to what it was like before 1979, Israel is on the edge of becoming a theocratic state. Perhaps the signatories of the Abraham Accords will need to play a role quietly to persuade Israel to keep its secular qualities. Asia too is connected to the problems of the other regions that I've mentioned. Prime Minister Kishida last June said that Ukraine today could be Asia tomorrow. Japan in December approved 3 new defense and security documents that radically changed Japan's strategic approach, making it a more extrovert power. It will move to spend 2% of GDP on defense. If that happens, the United States will be the #1 defense spender in the world, China #2, Japan #3, Germany #4 after the Zeitenwende. Whoever thought that Japan and Germany would be the number 3 and number 4 defense spenders in the world. And the reason is that Japan now distrusts China, Russia, and the DPRK all at the same time. What of China? China speaks of a multipolar world, but it wants a unipolar Asia. For too many small states in the Asia-Pacific, China's win-win diplomacy means China wins twice. China expects tribute from some of the smaller countries in the region, most of whom have their strongest strategic relationship with the United States, but its strongest economic relationship with China. But China's rise becomes so important that no country in the world, no matter how big or small, can afford not to have a China policy, and especially not to have a China policy on technological issues that are now becoming sort of the terrain of the new Cold War between the United States and China, as there are so many limitations being played on the semiconductor trade that is controlled basically by one company in Taiwan. But it's China's digital Silk Road, more important than its Belt and Road Initiative, that is giving it the heterodox access to data in more than 95 countries in the world that will make China a data superpower. So the big question here is whether there will be a great decoupling, or as the Europeans prefer, the effort will be focusing not on decoupling but de-risking. On these two very different strategies, decoupling or de-risking from China, the future of our interconnected world will depend. On Taiwan, by the way, I don't think there'll be a war in the next 5 years for 3 reasons. One, I think China will only use military force against Taiwan if it formally really does declare independence, or secondly, if it acquires a nuclear weapon. And right now, after Ukraine, in any case, the Central Military Commission will consider that if there's going to be a war against Taiwan, they better win in about a week, and they're not prepared to be able to do that. So what are my 3 policy advices? Oh, there's been one positive in Asia. It's been that Japan and Korea have now began a great reconciliation, which may be as important as the French and German one only last generation. 3 sentences for the West. Please do not start a new Cold War between democracies and autocracies. Democracy cannot be exported. The non-tariff barriers are too high. Democracy needs to have local roots. It cannot be fertilized from abroad. So the maxim that should govern the West should be good governance without democracy is safer than strategically than is democracy without good governance. Go for good governance. Democracy might eventually come. To the global south, strategic hedging. Very important thing to do. You can't rely on one security supplier. Multi-alignment is a good idea, but remember one thing. Strategic hedging, rather like financial hedging, requires active portfolio management. Russia's strategic currency is in decline, so you better not be overweight Russia. And finally, for companies, your future will depend on your quality of geopolitical analysis. Companies will need a foreign policy to navigate this world. Thank you so much.
John. Woo!